Everybody, I'm Thomas Nguyen, and my culminating project is titled Crime Free Has a Price. I currently work at HCD and at the state, and I work in fair housing policy. And I kind of came upon this topic through my work, and I kind of took it and ran with it for this project. And I put together somewhat of a public policy recommendation for the state of California. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so our story starts with Lakeisha Briggs in Norristown, Pennsylvania. One night, Lakeisha's boyfriend showed up at her apartment and became violent, and so her daughter called 911. After the police arrive, they tell Lakeisha that they're tired of responding to domestic disturbance calls at her residence, and if there were any more calls to the police, that they would have to order her landlord to evict her based on a local ordinance called a crime-free ordinance. So Lakeisha breaks up with her boyfriend, but shortly after, he shows back up at her residence and attacks her. But because of the previous incidents with the police, she refused to call for help. And this incident ends up with her being stabbed and hospitalized. On top of this, a neighbor called the police regarding the incident at that time, and she was evicted by her landlord and the city at the same time. So Lakeisha's story is just one example of the serious consequences and harms of the enforcement of crime-free ordinances. And these are becoming more and more common in local governments throughout the country. These ordinances, sometimes referred to by a variety of names like crime-free multifamily ordinances or nuisance property ordinances, are local laws that essentially seek to penalize landlords and tenants for excessive calls for services to the police or alleged criminal activity, mostly associated with rental properties. And essentially, they're a version of a 3 strikes law that just results in an eviction of a tenant for being placed under arrest or calling for emergency services. A lot of times, no conviction is required for an eviction to take place. And while their intent is to prevent crime in all its forms, which has merit, cases like Lakeisha Briggs's can be very costly for tenants. So why should California care? We've established that crime-free ordinances create unequal access for emergency services for tenants, but why else should we care? Currently in California, there are over 147 crime-free ordinances in different cities and counties. And my research for this project focused mostly on 4 themes: history, institutions, politics, economics, and also I touched on the legal concerns with crime-free ordinances. So history, whether intentional or not, there is a long list of housing policies in America that have had long-lasting, serious, long-term effects along racial lines. Policies like alien land laws, which denied Chinese immigrants ownership of land, and neighborhood redlining, which created barriers for Black and brown communities to access affordable financial loans from the feds, have all contributed to the racial wealth gaps that we observe today. And access to housing has long-term implications for generational wealth and social equity. Home ownership rates for Black Americans are still 30% lower than for white Americans today. While explicit forms of exclusion and segregation like redlining and alien land laws are no longer legal, we still see de facto examples of segregation like NIMBYism and housing unaffordability. And crime-free ordinances are an example of this de facto segregation or exclusion and deserve more scrutiny. Institutions. So the way the rental housing markets decides what tenants get priority access to housing is often biased. Landlords focus on credit scores, proof of income, and criminal background checks to decide who they rent tenants or rent units to. And on the face, this seems harmless and normal. More and more landlords are using third-party screening services to capture this data. And using the screening criteria is shown to disproportionately affect communities of color on various structural factors. For example, communities of color are much more likely to have poor credit scores or lower levels of income based on historic denial of affordable financial services and wealth building opportunities. Criminal background checks reinforce discrimination based on the fact that Black and brown people are incarcerated or come into contact with law enforcement at a much higher rate than white communities in the US. So landlords using these methods are disproportionately excluding people of color from housing opportunities. Politics. So these tools like alien land laws, redlining, and criminal background checks are examples of structural racism. And when you think about crime-free ordinances, it's really hard to not consider them in the same kind of way. You can't gloss over the fact that Black and brown communities are incarcerated or encounter police at a vastly higher rate than white communities. And when your housing status is impacted by societal factors that you have no control over, it really makes it hard to live and prosper in this country. And while America has reached new heights in diversity in its population, a lot of our neighborhoods have stayed the same in their racial composition. And while you can point to the many examples of de facto segregation as reasons why our communities remain segregated, it's reasonable to wonder whether crime-free ordinances are playing a part in keeping these communities segregated. Economics. So we all know the stats about how scarce and unaffordable housing is in California. Thank you, Connor. With the desperate current shortage of housing options for Californians, the state can't afford to allow policies like these to continue to displace people from their housing with little to no due process or substantial evidence for displacement. These ordinances sometimes require the eviction of entire households, even when the alleged criminal activity is limited to one single member of the household or a guest of the household. Again, these ordinances are enforced by the local municipality on the landlord and the tenants in these cases. And eviction in itself is a highly disruptive event that can have serious consequences for the cities and for the landlords. Cities can face increased levels of homelessness, costs for public health services, and even lawsuits. And landlords can, in the eviction process, face heavy costs stemming from eviction fees that they often aren't prepared for. So on top of the broader concerns with crime-free ordinances, there are legitimate legal concerns for them as well. There's a movement towards recognizing that the use of criminal history is a proxy for race, especially when there's a disparate impact on protected classes of race based on a policy. So if a policy is impacting one race more than another, or some races more than others, the argument can be made that they are discriminatory. So in this way, crime-free ordinances violate the Fair Housing Act. On top of this, these ordinances are in violation of due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, and which includes the right to notice and the opportunity to be heard. Multiple lawsuits regarding these ordinances have included these violations and have either been settled or ruled in favor of the complainants. So all this leads me to my recommendations for the state of California. There's a bill making its way through the legislature right now, AB 1418, that would essentially prohibit the mechanisms of crime-free ordinances, in that it would prohibit any tenants and landlords from being punished for simply contact with law enforcement or calls for services And surprisingly, this legislation has faced zero opposition to this point. And the proponents of this bill are overwhelmingly positive and optimistic that it will be passed. And if passed, landlords would still maintain the independent rights to evict any tenants that are creating nuisances, legitimate nuisances, but they just wouldn't be forced into it by cities. So short of approval of this bill, the state could opt to recommend an amended version of the bill that requires some level of due process in their evictions, stemming from crime-free ordinances. And if AB 1418 were unsuccessful altogether, the state could implement some kind of system of review for jurisdictions similar to how the state reviews housing elements for every city, checking for impacts to different communities based on their implementation of policies. However, this option could be ineffective because housing elements are only updated every 8 years. So while the prevention of crime is one of the basic functions of the government at every level, it must be balanced with the protection of every citizen's rights. These ordinances debatably tip the scale more in favor towards the violation of citizens' rights and interests, especially in situations where evidence of crime is insubstantial at best. To conclude, crime-free ordinances present a unique opportunity for California. There's a lot of political will right now to aggressively address housing, and the state is dedicating a ton of resources to addressing it. So I believe that if the state acts on these ordinances, it could be a big step forward toward more equity in housing. Thank you.
Does this bill try and address any past instances of, so if like, is there any work in this bill or another bill where they're looking at crime-free enforced evictions and removing those from people's records?
No, unfortunately, I don't think so, but that would be a good idea. Yeah.
So Thomas, this is a very interesting discussion, something I didn't know very much about. I'm curious though, some of the cities that you're talking about have long had non-white majorities on the council and progressive, at least ostensibly progressive majorities on the councils. Do you have any sense about what, or along the way, why the cities haven't changed those ordinances?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think public safety is a big topic in almost any municipality and almost always has a lot of political will. So I think it often takes something going wrong before it's addressed in any way. For example, the one like big lawsuit in California, the city of Hesperia versus the DOJ actually brought action against the city of Hesperia in Southern California, and they ended up repealing their crime-free ordinance, but they like settled out of court. Yeah. Thank you.
I always have so many questions. I'm wondering actually if you plan on presenting this to any cities. To Ted's point, I wonder if folks even know what the impact of those crime-free ordinances are.
Yeah, so these are just becoming more and more known about. The LA Times wrote an article about it in like 2020. And from my understanding, like a lot of these cities have it, and like South San Francisco has a ton of tenants, but I doubt a lot of those people even know that it exists. But I before the bill, I mean, internally at HCD, I am going to circulate this and hopefully, turn it into some kind of guidance or a memo that exists in our department. But I think just like the timing with the legislature, the bill is like really fortunate. So, yeah. Nice.
Yeah, one last question.
I will try to keep this quick. This is a fascinating presentation. And as someone who does history, one thing that really interested me, and I don't know if you looked at this, it's probably out of scope for what you're doing, but I'm wondering how that construction of that link between the housing and the crime came to be, to the point where the crime-free ordinance focused on eviction as the policy lever, as opposed to any number of other policy levers that it could lean on. But how did those two, did your research show what happened as to link those things?
Yeah. So they came about in like the late 90s by the International Crime Free Association out of Arizona. And it just, the focus was like anti-drug, and I think the like the tough on crime or tough on drug crime kind of attitudes just naturally lended to like, how can we remove this from our communities? And I think evicting someone is probably the first thing they thought about. And so, yeah. Thank you.